joined today's webinar. This is the first out of a series of webinars that we will be presenting once every 2 weeks on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. UK time, 7 a.m. PST. Today we will be hearing from Thomas Bonner and Thomas Smets from IntellectEU. They will be talking about their project KUBE, Know Your Customer on Blockchain. Now, if anybody has any questions, please use the Q&A box or raise your hand. We will be observing the Q&A and I'll be trying to answer the questions as we go. Towards the end, we will have a proper Q&A session. If you have any more questions, you can always use the chat and I'll be answering kind of the ongoing things. So with that, Thomas and Thomas, welcome. Thank you for joining us and take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Marta. Yeah, so first of all, we would like to thank Hyperledger and the Linux Foundation for this opportunity to present here today and to do this webinar and to kick off this series. We have been involved with the Hyperledger community since 2016, since the beginning as a founding member, and it has always been our pleasure to work together and to collaborate with this open source community. What we will try today is to give you a very short introduction into IntellectEU, what we do as a company, to an AML compliance as a use case, so more from a generic approach. What is the opportunity, the problem, and what do we see as a solution? And then my colleague Thomas Smets, who is our KYC business analyst, will dig a bit deeper into the KUBE platform itself. So KUBE is a project where IntellectEU is the technology partner of the Isabel Group in Belgium and 4 large Belgian banks, BNP Paribas, Belfius, KBC, and ING, where we are developing a KYC utility. We will go a bit deeper into the technology stack, the value proposition, and how it actually works. And then, as Marta said, we will leave definitely some time for Q&A. So let's dive into it. So me, myself, Thomas Bonner, I'm leading blockchain and DLT solutions at IntellectEU. IntellectEU has been around for quite a while. We were founded about 14 years ago as a traditional systems integrator. From there, we started working together with an organization named Swift, focused mainly on integration with back office systems, configuration of financial messaging, and implementation. From there, we have grown to become a global Swift services partner with multiple certified engineers, and we build up some capabilities and knowledge and know-how in the payments and financial services industry. From there on, we started looking into blockchain distributed ledger technologies, working with Ripple, Ethereum, or Breakthrough in 2016 as a founding member of Hyperledger. So very involved in the development of Fabric, the open source community, and still today doing a lot of these projects. And then fast forward to what our team is doing today. We're doing mainly product development of blockchain-based applications for financial services, being it central banks, stock exchanges, CSDs, retail and investment banks, and also expanding that to other industries like telcos and government. We work mostly with the technologies of the Hyperledger, and we have multiple projects into production today. So let's dive a bit deeper into KYC itself. So KYC stands for Know Your Customer, and Know Your Customer is a process that all financial institutions and have to do to be compliant with multiple regulations. These can be European, US-based regulations, but also there are some global regulations for Know Your Customer. And the main problem is that today this process of client onboarding is very paper-based, very manual, and very labor-intensive. And if we go look at some of the numbers, they're really big. The real cost of AML compliance is thought about to be over 110 billion yearly for financial institutions in US and Europe only. So this is without the financial institutions in APAC. Why is this so costly? Because most of the KYC programs, so the validation of customer data, of both for individuals, retail clients, as corporates, is very labor intensive. So these are really people, employees that are verifying, validating the data, doing monitoring, screening, and doing the risk assessment itself. So because of it so labor intensive, the average financial institutions has over 90 full-time employees employed in their compliance department. So as you can imagine, this also includes smaller asset managers, hedge funds, smaller financial institutions. So definitely tier 1, tier 2 banks, the really big banks, they have over 100, if not going up to thousands employees doing this very labor intensive manual work of KYC programs and data validation. We are mainly looking with IntellectEU in the KYC of corporates, mainly in small and medium enterprises, because there is where we see the first opportunity and the first problem. Because the KYC of an average SME account takes about 20 hours of due diligence. So this makes it actually pretty expensive. And to have a positive return on investment of onboarding this SME and giving this SME financial services products can take quite a while. So why has this industry not really evolved a lot? This is because we see a lot of market domination by 3 main players, being it Refinitiv, Dow Jones, and LexisNexis. We believe that by leveraging technologies such as RPA, blockchain, APIs, and digital first, we can decrease the onboarding time with 80% and also tremendously lower the costs. My apologies. It should be back. And also tremendously lower the costs for these financial institutions. So what is the actual problem? So first of all, there is a lack of transparency and the regulatory requirements for financial institutions are increasing. So we have GDPR, the data privacy requirements, which are becoming more and more stringent. We have the AML directives coming up where these banks have to check with the PEP lists, for example. What we also see as a main problem is that there is a duplication of efforts. So as a corporate, you can, for example, onboard with your first financial institution. And if you onboard with a second financial institution, you will have to provide almost the same data and go through the same lengthy process. It's even bigger than that. If you are, for example, let's say a client with a bank in Belgium, and you want to open an account in another country, let's say the UK, but with the same bank, you might have to go through the same processes of providing your data. The KYC officer might be doing again your KYC data validation. And this whole process might have a very negative impact, not only on the customer's happiness, the customer acquisition, but also on the productivity of employees, because they are doing very repetitive tasks of verifying this data. And then what we see also in this industry is that there is a clear lack of standards and accessibility of this data. So standards, what do we mean with this? We see that a lot of the financial institutions are asking the same data of these corporates over time in the onboarding process. So they might ask it in a different format, but the actual data set itself that they're requiring is quite the same. So there is an opportunity here to standardize this data set across financial institutions, and also to standardize the workflow of the client onboarding, but also of the tasks of updating the data, reviewing the data, and validating the data. So standardizing really the KYC data verification and updating process. And then what do we mean with accessibility? As most of you, if you work in financial services, know and understand, is that a lot of these banks have grown over time, and they have a lot of legacy systems in place. In these legacy systems, data is all scattered. There is no centralized master data management system where you can find the data of your retail or your clients. So there is no holistic view on actually the corporate identity of your clients for these banks. And so this is what we try to solve, and we believe that the solution is a platform infrastructure. So a shared interbank or intrabank KYC utility that can be based on distributed ledger technology. We believe distributed ledger technology can have a big impact on creating trust between multiple financial institutions and the ability to share the data. But as in most of the blockchain products and platforms that IntellectEU is building, blockchain is only a part of this. So we leverage smart contracts and other technologies to standardize the workflows and the data. This also goes beyond the technology, but also very important, there is a collaboration between banks, financial institutions, and eventually other industries. We believe a solution should be digital first, so a corporate should be able to onboard almost in minutes through an online web-based platform. This is then fully API driven, so can be integrated into the existing front office systems of the banks. We do this to shorten the onboarding flows and to also increase customer happiness. We believe it should be an open platform, so it should be able to integrate with third-party solutions to enrich the data and to make the whole verification and validation process as automated as possible. And then we use the DLT, preferably Hyperledger Fabric, as a core platform for the distribution of the data, more specifically of the proofs of the validation. But Thomas will dig a bit deeper into that later on during the actual use case. Isabel Group, very shortly an introduction. So we are working with 5 financial institutions. The Isabel Group, who is leading this project from a business and governance and IT maintenance perspective, who also initiated this project with its 4 shareholders, the big banks, BNP Paribas, Belfius, KBC, and ING. The plan is to expand this platform for banks across Europe over time. Corporates of more than 5 European countries will be onboarded. There have been a lot of conversations with the regulators and the government involved to make it a fully compliant solution. And also within Isabel Group and definitely at IntellectEU, we see the potential to expand this to other industries. So very shortly touch upon that. KYC is a process that banks have to do because they have to be compliant with all these regulations. But think about, for example, the telco industry that is continuously onboarding retail and corporate clients, and it also needs to verify and validate this data. For them, it can also be a very helpful solution. And then other data consumers like accountants, lawyers, and the government itself that can leverage this validated data. So I will stop here with this very short introduction on IntellectEU, on where we think the opportunity is with Know Your Customer programs. And then I will give the floor to my colleague Thomas, who will dig a bit deeper into the actual KUBE project.
Yes, thank you. So as Thomas already mentioned during the introduction, my name is Thomas as well. It's not the most original name in Belgium. and I work as an analyst on the KUBE project. So can you maybe go to the next slide? So Thomas already stated nicely the problem and what we see as a solution, but we not only see it as a solution, we're actually helping in developing it together with the 4 big banks of Belgium and Isabel Group. So to give a short summary, what do we see as the 3 big solutions to help banks in making this KYC process less expensive? It is 1, to standardize the KYC data set that every financial institution needs to collect, to standardize the processes around it, to make it all digital, and lastly, to have just 1 shared truth of the data set that is shared between the different banks. So how do we reach those goals with our application? I am going to show you this with the 3 most important flows in the KUBE project first. After that, we dive a bit deeper in the technology stack that we use to run our application. And then finally, this gives a good summary of how you reach those value propositions that Thomas showed in his last slide. So what you see on the screen is the first onboarding flow of a legal entity. So what are the participants that you see on the screen? We have the legal entity on the left top. He wants to onboard at a bank, Bank A in this case, and important, the entity is not yet on the KUBE system. So it's the first time the entity will onboard at the bank, but also the first time he onboards at 1 bank that is a participant in the KUBE system. In the middle, we have our KYC application. On top, we have 3rd parties that provide data. We have our ledger and the regulator. So what are now the flows? First, the entity goes to a bank and they ask, I want to become a client. The bank says, okay, please onboard via our KUBE system. So the entity goes online to the KYC KUBE platform. The first thing that we'll do is we already try to pre-fill our data set in the application as much as possible with data we get from 3rd sources. And so here we want to help the digital onboarding. We want to use data that already exists as much as possible. So the 3rd sources are used. We already have some data in our data set. And then we go to point 4. The entity completes its data set. Then very important, in our application, we don't only collect data, we also immediately verify the data. This is really a labor-intensive process that the bank has to do. So this is step 5. The bank will look at each data field in the data set. They will verify if what the entity states is indeed correct. And if that is the case, they put their verification on the data. Once the whole data set is filled, it is verified, it is then stored in 1 database at the bank side. So what we have done so far is nothing different than how the KYC onboarding process works today. Then what is the big difference is that we have standardized this data set. So the data the legal entity has to provide between all financial institutions, and it is step 7. So once all the data is collected and verified, we will store it on the ledger. Of course, we won't store the data itself on the ledger because GDPR says that you have the right to be forgotten while a ledger is immutable. So if you would store data direct on the ledger, it is not compliant with GDPR regulation. So what do we do instead? We just store a hash of the data on the ledger while we keep the data itself in a private database that only Bank A sees. What do we store as well? We store as well the verification of the bank. So we store on the ledger a proof that Bank A has done some work to verify the data. And then lastly, we store a consent that the legal entity gave to Bank B to share and use its data. Okay, so far here we gained already a standardized process and we have an easy digital onboarding. But the real power of KUBE will be visible in the next slide. So Thomas, can you go to the next slide? Okay, no, yeah, it's the right one. So now we see the real benefits of KUBE. The legal entity is already a client at Bank A, but now they want to onboard at Bank B as well. How it works today is that they have to go through the whole process again of entering all their data, and Bank B has to verify everything as well. With KUBE, this is not necessary. With KUBE, we will be able to reuse the work the entity has done to provide this data and to reuse the work that Bank A performed to verify it. So how does it work? The entity again asks at Bank B to become a client, but now Bank B says, okay, please onboard via KUBE since you already are a customer at Bank A. Now the entity provides a consent to Bank B that they may use the data. So they register on the ledger that Bank B can have access to the data of the entity. Once this is done, Bank B will send a request to Bank A. Can I please have the data of the entity? Of course, Bank A won't just believe that Bank B has the right to receive the data. No, Bank A will first check on the ledger if Bank B indeed has the consent to receive the data. And if this is the case, Bank B will transfer the data from their private database to the private database of Bank B. If Bank B has received the data, they want to be sure that it is the right data that the entity entered some couple of weeks before. How can they be sure? They will hash all the data and then they will check if that hash corresponds with what is on the ledger once what is on the ledger from when Bank A collected and verified the data. So in this way, Bank B can still be sure that the data they received from Bank A is indeed the data that the entity provided. If everything is okay, Bank B will of course compensate Bank A. So this is really, they will give some money to Bank A because Bank A did all the verification work and Bank B just can receive all the data without the need of this lengthy process of collecting and verifying data. Okay, then we can go to the next slide. So we now have a legal entity that is onboarded at Bank A and Bank B. And now we arrive at a step that is often forgotten when people talk about KYC processes. They always talk about the onboarding. But actually the big work of the compliance departments at bank is handling all the updates of KYC data. For instance, in Belgium alone, a country of 11 million people, there are more than 1 million small and medium entities. A number of them are clients at financial institutions. So all the data of all those entities needs to be updated. In the current processes, if an entity has data that is changed, they have to go to all the banks they are client of separately to update their data. So this is again a lot of redundant work, both for the entity as for the bank. With KUBE, this is not necessary. With KUBE, the entity will update his data at one bank, and then via KUBE, this update will arrive at all the banks in a trustless way. So how does this work? The entity goes, in this example, to Bank B to update one piece of their information. It's, for instance, they change address. So they go to Bank B and they say, okay, we want to change our address. The bank will request the entity to change it in the KUBE system. So again, the entity changes in KUBE that their address is now somewhere else. Bank B will verify if this indeed is correct. Is this entity indeed now at another address? If it's the case, they will store it locally and they will update the ledger. So they will store a new hash of the data because the address changes, the hash of the data will change as well. And they will store that they did verification work so that other banks indeed know that it's true. If the ledger is updated and bank A has consent from the entity to access the data, they will see, okay, there is an update made by bank B, and bank A will request bank B, can I please have this update as well? And then the steps that follow are the same as we saw in the previous slide. So bank B will first check if bank A indeed has an access grant of the entity. So if they have the right to share and receive the data of that entity. If this is the case, they will send the data back to bank A. Bank A will then compare the data they received with the hash on the ledger. And if this is also okay, they will send a monetary reward to bank B to pay for the work that bank B has done. So in this slide, you can easily see how we managed to reach our 3 goals. So with the KYC application, we have one data set and one processes for KYC at all financial institutions that participate in our network. It is all digital, so the onboarding, all the steps that have to be followed as updates, and we use third-party sources to pre-fill the data set already during onboarding. Also for the updates, for instance, we can use third parties who initiate updates. And then lastly, we have one shared truth, which is immutable and which is also auditable. What is also very interesting for regulators. So if there in the end is something wrong with a company, if they are laundering money, the regulator can see where in the whole KYC process the error was made, so who should pay the fines. Okay, so we went now over what are the different flows, what should our application do. Let's now take a look at how our technology stack looks like. So how is the application built? Let's start with the real core application itself. So these are the 3 top layers, the API gateway, the orchestration app, and the different components. So at Intellect, we use for applications a cloud-based system where we leverage Docker and Kubernetes. What does this mean? Actually, we instead of one big application, we built all small components. These are actually applications on themselves, which communicate with each other API-based. So they send API calls to each other. What is the advantage from this? Is that each task that has to be performed works in its own application. So in this, it's a very scalable way to work. If we need a new functionality, we can just make a new component and make it interact with the existing components. It's easy testable, and we can reuse similar components in different projects. So now let's take a look at the individual components. So since it's API based, our whole application, we of course have an API gateway. This is really for access management, to see that if someone requests data, if they are the person they say they are. It's also to balance loads if there are multiple concurrent calls. So it's really the security component. Next, we have the orchestration application. What this do is to handle complex tasks which require multiple components to work together. So they will determine the order in which different components work, or if some components need information from another component, they will make sure that all processes go well. And then the top, this is actually our real application. And so each individual component will tackle one of the tasks we saw in our flows. And so the first and most important one is the KYC dataset application. This application manages everything that has to do with the dataset itself, the rules, how it should be filled in. It handles the evidence documents. It handles the verification the bank makes. So it handles all those processes. The second important is the grant application. So this application checks and updates the access grants certain financial entities have for the data set of a legal entity. Then we have some more generic applications as a notification application, the ledger gateway, and general workflows and templates. So we have, as I said before, one internal database. It's also one component. And here we, for this project, we worked with Postgres. Then I think what is interesting for a lot of people in the call is actually then what do we use for our blockchain layer, our ledger. We use, for the moment, Hyperledger Fabric 1.4. Probably once we go in production, we will go to 2.0, but currently everything is written in with Hyperledger 1.4. Here we have three main smart contracts. So one is for storing the consent of the financial institutions. So it's to store that financial institutions have the right to share and receive data of a certain entity. We store the hashes of the data as a proof that we received at that time, the data that we store. If we later send it to another entity, because we have stored the hash of the data on the ledger, the other entities can verify that the data they received is the same as the data that was stored. And lastly, we store the different verification each bank made to prove that what the entity claimed is correct. To reach a consensus between the different order nodes in the network, we use the Raft protocol. That's the standard protocol for Fabric 1.4. Then something we are very proud of that we also use in a lot of our applications is the Catalyst blockchain platform. Where do we use it for? So we work with Hyperledger Fabric. So the 4 banks in our network today have to use Hyperledger Fabric, but a lot of them actually use in their own bank site different cloud providers. So what we can do with our Catalyst blockchain platform, it's something we built with IntellectEU, and it's really a platform as a server. We can run Hyperledger Fabric on it, but it is cloud agnostic. So we can host our platform both in Azure, in Amazon, with IBM Cloud. So in this way, we can really make applications that are more than just a nice proof of concept. We really make applications that banks and institutions can use. The last part you see on our technology stack is the Catalyst integration solution. This is also something we developed with IntellectEU. Why is this necessary? Of course, a KYC application won't work standalone in a bank. It has to be connected with their legacy systems. And it is not that easy to connect a legacy system with DLT. So this is really what Catalyst does. It's really made to connect external sources, to connect legacy systems with new applications that use DLT technology. Okay, then I think to summary what we said today, how can our platform provide value? One, it's a trusted platform with one single truth. So first, we have a standard KYC data set and a standard lifecycle. There is only one truth of a data set that is shared between the different financial institutions. Because it uses a blockchain, it is fully auditability. So if there is somewhere a legal entity that made a mistake, it is perfectly possible to track which institution made a mistake. It's an open platform with governance body and rules. So new participants can join the network. Very important, it is completely regulatory compliant. So we already mentioned anti-money laundering and GDPR, but legislation for banks is way stricter. And we also have competition law and bank secrecy. And those four together really show why we need a blockchain. So we want to have a shared truth, but because we are also fall under competition law and bank secrecy, we can't just work with one bank that collects centralized all the data and then distribute it to the other. No, we really have to work together without giving away information that shouldn't be shared. Our whole solution is API driven. We use microservices, so it's easy integratable. It is modular, flexible, and if there are new processes needed, we can make new components. It is all digital, and we have the pre-fill. We have an easy data set application, both for the legal entity as for the KYC officer. And last but not least, it are not only financial institutions who are obliged to do the KYC of entities. We can also think of insurance companies. We can think of leasing companies. They also have to do, it's more limited than a financial institution, but they also have to do their KYC work. We can imagine they are interested to join our network, and that the financial institutions actually can make a revenue stream out of verifying data. They can then sell it also to other third parties, of course, with consent of the legal entity.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And before we dive into Q&A, I very shortly also want to touch upon some of the challenges that we have seen with IntellectEU and how we have been involved in this project and have been involved in overcoming some of these challenges and the lessons learned related to that. So we were involved with this project from the beginning on, helping doing business analysis, the requirements with the regulatory teams, the compliance teams, but also from an architecture side, because we work with a new technology, being it blockchain and Hyperledger and Hyperledger Fabric. And as much as we love to work with it, we still see some challenges there, definitely in the deployment and on the running phase. These technologies are very good and very easy to deploy some proof of concepts, to do prototypes, but to actually bring it into production is an whole other story. And there with IntellectEU, not only with this project, but also some of our other Hyperledger Fabric projects, we have been able to overcome those. So definitely working with financial institutions where we see very strict non-functional and security requirements. We have collaborated very closely with them to get this right, to get all the tooling for monitoring, etc., for the blockchain ready, and then as well provide these integration services. As Thomas said, blockchain applications and definitely not data sharing applications can exist as standalones, but they need to be integrated within your own organization, and then they also need to be open to be integrated with other platforms. And I see a very interesting question here already in the Zoom webinar chat. So from John Callahan, thank you for that question. It says, how can KUBE be integrated with W3C DIDs and W3C verifiable credentials as supported in Hyperledger India and Aries? So very good and interesting question. So as an open platform, and as we recognize that there will be multiple identity platforms and multiple KYC platforms for other industries, for other geographies, we believe that there is an importance for interoperability. And so this interoperability between blockchains is definitely something that we try to solve with our Catalyst integration solution. It's something that we believe that from a technology perspective, technicalities perspective can definitely be solved, but where we see more challenges still is for the industry to come together and work together on making these standards interoperable. And we strongly believe the positioning of a foundation like Linux and the Hyperledger project can help us with that. So John, if you're involved there, more than happy to also take this offline and see where we can help and support you into this interoperability question, as it's something that definitely interests us. And this whole collaboration thing brings me to another challenge. So what we have seen is collaborating with the financial institutions has been key to make this a success. But has always also been a big challenge. From a physical perspective, how do you get all the persons together in the same meeting room? How do you free up the time to agreeing on certain concepts around standardization and IT infrastructure? Has been a real challenge, but it is key to collaborate to move forward to success. And so also there, IntellectEU is more than happy to guide its clients beyond the KUBE project into these different kind of collaboration and governance models. So that's it from my side. I don't know if you wanted to add something, Thomas, and otherwise I think we can go for Q&A.
No, I think it was a very comprehensive answer.
Okay. And so, by the way, our contact details are also on this last slide. So if you have anything to follow up with us, feel free to reach out as well, or ask your questions now, of course.
Wonderful. Thank you both. This was really interesting. I'm very much looking forward to the slides and follow-ups. So I'll start with questions. I'm not seeing anybody. Oh, there's one person that raised their hand. So Christian, if you'd like to speak up, I'll allow you to talk. So please ask your question.
I was just curious to understand your collaboration with Ripple, because it's a very big institution right now in blockchain. What have you done specifically with the Ripple Labs? Thank you.
So IntellectEU, as a payment specialist, blockchain company and integration company, we have mainly done work on the integration side. So as you know, Ripple, beyond their crypto, XRP and liquidity, also has a messaging payment layer. This needs to be integrated in financial institutions and banks, and that's something where IntellectEU can help.
Okay, great. So we have a couple of questions, 4 questions in the Q&A. If anybody else has more questions, please just click on the Q&A at the bottom and you'll see the questions. You can vote and comment on them as well. So I'll start from the beginning. Why Hyperledger Fabric blockchain is the choice of technology? There is other identity blockchain framework like Hyperledger Indy, and it could be used for the identity solutions.
Yes, so I will start with this one. So we have started this project about 2 years ago, and 2 years ago when we started looking into multiple blockchain technologies, one of the most important requirements for these financial institutions was that the blockchain technology to use was enterprise grade, ready for production, and had been tested into production. With IntellectEU, we had already multiple solutions on Hyperledger Fabric running in production environments with financial institutions in production. So we were able to guarantee these requirements, definitely the security and non-functional requirements. At that time, Indy and other Hyperledger projects were much more in an R&D and development phase. And we needed to move forward. move forward to start collaboration, getting the consortium together, and defining the IT design and architecture. And that has been our main driver to choose for Hyperledger Fabric. At that time, it was also one of our main focuses at IntellectEU. And so we had a lot of, and still are building out a lot of development capacities for Fabric. And still today, we believe that this solution for the data sharing that we are doing, that Fabric is the right technology that we have in place. So Thomas, don't know if you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just maybe it's really the banks want to use it in production. So it's not a proof of concept. It's not a minimum viable product. They really want to use it on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, they want one of the most mature solutions as possible. So that's the big reason we go with Hyperledger Fabric. And also, yeah, we have the knowledge to work with it. It's easy, integratable with a lot of things we already had. So we think it's the best for this use case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then maybe shortly to add it, because with IntellectEU, we do work with other technologies like Corda, we do work with other Hyperledger technologies, we do work with the digital asset modeling language that is ledger agnostic. We're very passionate about these technologies, and we believe for a lot of different use cases, they are right. But here, as we are only sharing these proofs, these verifications, and if we then look at the cost, the non-functional requirements, we believe that Fabric is definitely the right solution. So I hope this answers your question.
Awesome, thank you. And of course, that must have been the moment my thing beeped. So you mentioned doing a test with Hyperledger Fabric is easy, but it's hard to deploy. Can you please mention a few examples?
Yes, definitely. So Hyperledger Fabric, if you deploy it in the easiest way, so just a few nodes in a testing environment, it's pretty easy. But if you want to do automated deployment with a decentralized governance model, where everything is running in high availability, hot-cold storage, automatic failover, reconnection mechanisms, there is still a lot of additional coding that you will have to do, or the writing of manual scripts to get this all right. So this is definitely something that we had to overcome and are overcoming. With IntellectEU, Thomas also touched shortly upon that. We have built a Catalyst blockchain platform, which is a solution to do the automatic deployment of a Hyperledger Fabric solution. And what we also see is definitely when you deploy in an enterprise environment, that everything around monitoring, logging, managing your smart contracts, managing the health of your peers becomes more and more important. And what we understood over the past few months and years is that most of the IT people, operations people are not blockchain experts. So if you come in there and you start talking about peers and connection and decentralization and distributed networks, this is all very new for them. So also for their security and for their IT ops people, deploying something in a distributed infrastructure, different cloud or on-prem environments is a challenge that we had to overcome together with them, mainly by putting in place the right tools, right training, and having the right communication between the different participants.
Thank you. I hope this answers the question. How are distributed the nodes between participant, and how many nodes are there?
So each participant in the network, which are the 4 banks and an Isabel Group, will all run their own nodes. So it's mainly 5.
Awesome. At step 5, is it manual verification on KUBE platform?
I think I have to see the slide again because I don't know by heart what step 5 is.
I think here,
yeah, indeed. That is still manual. Yeah, because it's not all possible to do automated. We just try to have as much as possible validation rules hard-coded. For instance, if it's a social security number, there are checksums possible. So validations as such, we do in an automated way. Some really have to be checked by a person. So in 5, there are still some manual steps indeed. But
yeah.
as we told, the onboarding process the first time is still this lengthy process the KYC officer has to do. But with KUBE, it's only one time one bank has to do it instead of all banks that have to do it for the same legal entity for the same data. So here, the manual work still has to be done, but with our application, we want to digitize it as much as possible, because today, step 4 and 5 are really often paperwork where a legal entity has to fill in paper by hand, then it has to be retyped in by a KYC officer. That is something we want to avoid in the future, but not all manual processes can be eliminated here.
Thank you. 3 more questions and 9 more minutes. So you had mentioned the use of 3 smart contracts. One was the KYC verification. May I know what the other 2 ones are?
Yeah. So the first one is indeed to update the verifications of a certain data set on the ledger. A second is to update the data itself on the ledger. And so if I change my address, it's a different address in the private node, but then also the hash will be different. So then we have a smart contract that for that legal entity updates the hash of the data, so that there is a one-on-one connection between what is in the private database of the financial institution and what is on the ledger. And then the third one is to manage the access rights of different financial institutions for one data set. So it basically is, if we have an entity X, which banks can share data about entity X between each other. Because yeah, if an entity is not a client of a certain financial institution, that financial institution should not receive any data about that entity. I hope that answered the question.
Hopefully, if not.
Yes, if not, you can add a comment, no problem.
And then how much throughput have you been able to generate with Hyperledger Fabric at production level?
Yes, so development work is not yet finished, and so I can give a definitive answer to that question.
Yeah,
but for the
except for KUBE, we have done some. There has been some tests outside of KUBE where we have reached substantial amounts of throughput. But then I think maybe important to see here is we're not building a new clearing and settlement system here, right? We're not building a trading system for cash equities. We're building a data validation and verification system. As Thomas said, there are some million updates on this data, but this is spread over a year. So there is no need for a 1,000 transactions per second throughput, as well as that the throughput, the importance of having it in real time as soon as possible is less important in this specific use case than, for example, in a clearing and settlement system or in a trading system where really milliseconds can matter. So that also might come back a bit to our earlier question, why we have chosen Fabric, because we have tested it for the throughput that is needed for this specific use case. It can handle a lot more than what we are expecting at the moment to have when we go live, but we might choose a different framework or technology if we work with other clients, for example, and we build other systems for other use cases.
Thank you. That's very comprehensive. So I'll let you choose because I don't think we'll manage to question both of those questions. So I'll ask to follow up separately. One question is how your platform can help mortgage industry, and the second question is how is handle the compensation phase, like with a token, or how do you compensate? So please choose which one you'd prefer, and this will be the last question.
We'll very shortly answer the mortgage question, and then you can take the second.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So the mortgage, yes, it can definitely help everywhere in the onboarding process of financial products as reference data, a gateway. If you want more information, definitely reach out to us. And then Thomas, how is the compensation handled?
So it's not with tokens. We won't do the settlement immediately. We will just net over a specific amount of time how much new updates were shared between institutions, and then based on that, banks will be compensated more in the traditional way. So it's also maybe in the future a possible added functionality, but we do it step by step.
Step by step approach.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I know that you are very open to any kind of communication, and you have provided the contact details. So thank you everybody who participated. Thank you both Thomases for really incredibly interesting presentation. I would like to highlight 3 more webinars that are coming up, because as we have said, these will happen once every 2 weeks. The first one is on April 29th. It will be a special Ask Me Anything. It is open only to our members though. And it will be a panel discussion between Brian Bellendorf and Joe Lubin. For everybody else, we have 2 very exciting webinars upcoming. The blockchain technology partners will be talking about delivering the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange securities lending platform using Hyperledger Sawtooth, and another Hyperledger Sawtooth webinar, which will be end-to-end pork meat traceability that Scontras did with Unilever. If you are dying for content, please visit the website and our YouTube channel, because we have loads of really interesting videos and highlights from the Hyperledger Global Forum. We've recorded almost all of the sessions and workshops, so you can really find loads of content. If you have any questions, please reach out to me and Hyperledger team on membership@hyperledger.org. Thank you and stay safe.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Marta.